Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you being here. In this video, I'm going to share a quick and simple card that I made from these beautiful new Floral Trims stamps. I'm going to use the sticky mat for my Misti in order to position my paper. Now, I messed up with recording, so I didn't get the stamping and the recording from the first image, but here it is for the second one. I put a little Sharpie mark where I wanted my top corner to go for the stamp. So I'm positioning my stamp and I'm positioning my sentiment, and then I'm going to stamp and emboss them with gold. Now these, what I originally was going to do for this card was inspired by a card that was done in the released video that Tim Holtz did by one of his makers. They had done this stamp and they had done some stamping and embossing on vellum and had a little bit of an overlay with a torn edge. So I was going to do something similar but with gold vellum. The original video had white vellum. And in the end, I actually didn't do that, which you can tell by the thumbnail because I just didn't like how it looked. But I just wanted to keep that in here so that I could show you how to stamp and position pieces in exactly the same orientation. So this is watercolor paper here. I stamped and embossed it with gold embossing powder. And because I put a little Sharpie mark where I have my top left corner of my paper, I can easily put my vellum in exactly the same spot. This sticky mat has a grid right on it, so I can make sure that everything is perfectly lined up. My papers are a little bit bigger than I actually want them to be so that I can trim them down and line everything up, although the lining up will be quite easy. But I always like to have papers that are a little bit bigger and then trim them down after I'm done my watercoloring. I'm going to use some watercolor pencils as well as some magicals to add a little bit of shimmer to the card. I was just in the mood for this day to just do some simple watercoloring. So the watercolor pencils are perfect for this. I can actually just use my Waterbrush and take the color right off the pencil. I don't necessarily need a palette. The watercolor pencils are a little bit more opaque than the Distress die pad refills, so it's very similar to watercolor but just a slight different look to it. The refills I find are a little bit brighter to begin with, but they have a little bit more of a transparent look to them. So typically when watercoloring flowers, I like the dark color to be on the center of the flower, kind of like a shadow towards the center of the flower. So that's where I start with my brush when I've got the ink loaded, and I work my way out as there's less color on my brush. If I need to remove any color, I just take a paper towel, clean off my brush, and then lift off some excess color. And it's an easy way to kind of control exactly where there's darker color and where there's lighter color. Now, this is easy to do when it is wet. If you let it dry first, to remove the color, you'd need to wet the entire area first and then try to remove it, but some of it may have soaked in the paper by then. So again, easiest to do it when it's wet. And if that dark area is not as dark as you would like it to be, you can just take your water brush, add a little bit more ink to it from the watercolor pencil, and then tap it into the wet area where you want the darker color to go, and it will blend out itself a little bit. You may need to help it a little bit, but often it will kind of blend itself out while everything is still wet. I also like to put a dark area under where a petal goes underneath another petal. There would be a natural shadow there, so that is also where I put some of the dark areas. I'm going to speed up my watercoloring in a minute just because it does take a little while. I find watercoloring to be very mesmerizing. I just like doing it. It relaxes me. And sometimes you just want a nice, easy technique that you don't necessarily need to think too much about. And for me, that's kind of watercoloring. I can't say in any way, shape, or form I'm a professional at it. I've seen some absolutely beautiful watercolored images that are absolutely stunning. I'm nowhere near that level, but I do really enjoy doing it. And like I said, it's just relaxing for me. So I'm working one flower at a time. I'm going to do watercolor pencils for these bright pink flowers, and then I'm going to take out some of the Lindy's Magicals shimmer powder, and I'm going to watercolor some of the other powders or some of the other flowers. Now, it ended up being a little bit more coral than I thought the color was going to be. I thought it was going to be a little bit more pink, but that's okay. I love the two of them together. And the watercoloring with the Magicals powders, it just gives it a little bit of extra shimmer. It's just a bit of a different finish from the watercolor pencils. The watercolor pencils have a tiny little bit of opacity to them, but the more water you add to them, the more transparent they will be. As I said before, when I was stamping and embossing the image, I'm working on watercolor paper. You could also do this on mixed media paper, but you definitely want to be working on a surface that can handle the water. So watercolor or mixed media paper is perfect for this. You don't want to do this on regular cardstock. Regular cardstock is not meant to handle the water, and you need to use a cardstock that is suitable for the technique that you're wanting to do. For the pink color, I'm using the Picked Raspberry watercolor pencil. For the greens, I am using peeled paint as well as Rustic Wilderness. And then for my second card, I add a little bit of, no, actually for this one, I add a little bit of Kitsch Flamingo for the light pink, and then I go over it with the Lindy's Magicals. I wanted to have a light pink base to it because I was thinking I would just put the Magicals in the center of the flower when I thought it was going to be a little bit more of a pink tone than that. But because it's coral, I end up pulling the color all the way to the side. Once again, same as when I'm working with the watercolor pencil, I start at the center of the flower because that's where I want the darkest color to be. And then I add a little bit more water as I work my way out. I use my paper towel to blot off excess water and to clean my paintbrush off, just so that I can control exactly how much color I'm putting down. Now, because I stamped and embossed this image, I have really easy control over keeping my paint in the different areas because the embossing is a little bit raised, so it kind of works like a dam. If you were to do this with a stamped image that was not embossed, you would want to work on petals that aren't beside each other, because if those petals are beside each other, they're going to start to bleed into each other and you're not going to be able to control where the darks and lights are. By stamping and embossing your image, especially if you're a beginner, it just keeps it a little bit easier. It makes a really nice edge to it too, because we've got a nice fine gold line for this, but it just makes it a little bit easier to begin watercoloring if you have a stamped and embossed image. That way you don't have to worry so much about the colors bleeding into the area next to it. So for the second card, I'm doing some beautiful blue flowers here. I love this blue Magicals color. So I thought it would be really, really pretty as flowers. I typically like flowers when they're a little bit non-traditional colors. So I just thought this would be a nice change. And at this point, I was still thinking I was going to put the gold vellum on top of it. So I thought the gold and the blue might be nice together. Again, I'm doing the same technique as the first card. I'm starting the color in the center of the flower. So that's where it's going to be the darkest. It's going to be lighter towards the outside of the petals. Any place I want a little bit more deepness or any of the dark blue color, I'm just going back in with some more of that paint on my brush and I'm tapping it in there and letting it bleed itself out. The water brush that I love to use has water right in the handle, so I don't need to have a water cup anywhere nearby. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, especially when it comes to having water cups nearby. I would be the first one to either knock it over or drink out of it. So by having the water in the brush, I can easily clean my brush off or control how much water is in there. And I just use that little paper towel that I have the side there. It just works perfect for me and I don't have to worry about possibly knocking something over and ruining things. I used 2 of the different colors of Magicals. It's from the Victorian Bouquet set. I'll list and link everything that I'm using down in the description box below. But I used the blue and I used the kind of corally color from that set. You definitely could use some of the other colors as well. I just didn't want to be too overwhelmed with shimmer. And I like the look of different textures or different finishes when I'm creating cards. So now I'm doing the greenery for this one. Once again, I'm using peeled paint, and then I also put some Rustic Wilderness towards the bottom of the leaves as well as behind where they go behind the flowers. It's always nice to have that little bit of shadow in it. Just gives it a little bit more visual interest. I'm going to let those completely dry. And this is where I've got them all completely dry, and I was going to take those vellum pieces and tear them to match my watercolor pieces. First thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to cut my watercolor pieces down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. My pieces were cut down from pads before this and they're bigger than I needed them to be, which I like to keep them that size until I completely finish my coloring, just to make sure that I can choose the best part for the front of a card. I'm going to take my vellum overlay and I'm just ripping the edge just to kind of create a rustic edge or whatnot if you would like. So I put it on top of there and it just completely covered what was underneath there. I thought maybe some of that would show through a little bit more. And like I said, I really didn't like it. I liked the image watercolored on its own better. So I decided to ditch that idea and just do watercolored floral cards. I think they look so pretty just as they are, and they really don't need a whole lot extra to them. These florals are so nice and big that you could do pretty much whatever you want with them. They can cover a complete card front if you want, or you can just do part of it stamped off the side like I did. So I've got 2 pieces of cardstock here that I cut down to 5.5 by 8.5, and I'm just scoring them down in the center at 4.25 to create my card bases. I like to fold my card bases right in my score tool so that I know that I have them folded properly. I added some gold mats to go around my images. So my card fronts are 4.25 by 5.5. Those gold mats were cut at 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And then my image pieces were cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So there's just a little bit of 1/8 of an inch around each of those areas. To add a little bit of texture to the card front, I'm using some Nuvo crystal drops in a pale gold color that will coordinate really nicely with my embossing. And I'm just putting little dots in the center of the flowers. There's a lot more in the flowers on the blue card, so there's a lot more texture there. There's only a few in the flowers on the pink and coral card, so I'm only doing a few of them on there. Definitely want to make sure to let those dry good and well before putting anything into an envelope. So these are the finished cards there. I'm so pleased with how they turned out. The shimmer on them is very, very subtle, but it's very beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fantastic day.